How would you like to be more agile as a business? How would you like to be able to navigate opportunities better organizationally and as a leader? That's what we're talking about today. And so you are in the right place. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, the second episode, if all goes as planned, in 2020. Kind of hard to even think about that. We're not recording this in 2020. We're recording this in November of 2018. And I've got two gentlemen with me. You're going to love to get to know them. We're going to talk to them and talk about their brand new book. And let me introduce them to you first. First, Leo Tilman is a leading, and if you're watching us, he's the guy with the necktie. Leo Tilman is a leading expert on risk, strategy, and finance, and a longtime advisor to companies, governments, and institutional investors around the world. Prior to founding his namesake strategic advisory firm, Tilman held senior roles at BlackRock and Bear Stearns, and taught finance at Columbia University, his graduate and undergraduate alma mater. He's the author of 3 earlier books, including Financial Darwinism. He helped shape the modern concept of risk intelligence, and in collaboration with the U.S. government, created innovative models for public-private partnerships. And with him, the gentleman with the suit jacket and no tie is General Charles Chuck Jacoby. He is a military leader whose career in uniform culminated as a 4-star commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and U.S. Northern Command. He has led at all levels in peace and war, including heading the federal military response to Hurricane Sandy and commanding the 135,000-member multinational corps during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2009 and 10. He served as the Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as the U.S. military representative to the UN. He is the Distinguished Chair of Modern War Institute at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, his undergraduate alma mater. He holds graduate degrees from the School of Advanced Military Studies, the National War College, and as a Boilermaker, unfortunately, the University of Michigan. I had to get that in, Chuck, and I grew up in Michigan, but I had to. After all of that amazing stuff, I've got to have a little.
Yeah, would you like a football coach?
I'm pretty happy with ours, even though we don't have a very good season going. But I'm mostly happy that it's now basketball season. I'll just say that. All right. Hey, so thanks, guys. And by the way, they are together the co-authors of a brand new book titled Agility: How to Navigate the Unknown and Seize Opportunity in a World of Disruption. And we're going to talk about the book as we go. So welcome to both of you. I'm glad that you're here.
Great to be here.
We hear this introduction of both of you coming from largely very different worlds, and so I think we'd all like to hear the backstory of how you guys got connected and what became the path to this book. So, Leo, how did you meet this guy? How did that all happen? And maybe you guys talk a little bit about how we went from there to a book.
Again, great to be here, and very much looking forward to this conversation. So my background is finance and strategy, and I've spent most of my life advising companies and governments out of big platforms. But then in 2013, something very interesting happened. U.S. government realized that they are actually in the business of asset management, having lost a lot of money on Solyndra and having realized that they now manage $3.5 trillion worth of assets. So they embarked on real soul searching with respect to how to bring best practices in risk management and strategy and portfolio management to the management of the government balance sheet, and we were closely involved in that. So this received a lot of attention because, the need to do this on this scale was really urgent. And it was exactly around the time when General Jacoby was retiring from Northern Command in NORAD, and we got introduced and really hit it off right off the bat. General Jacoby became really involved in all of these issues with the government and with private companies. But throughout, we kept returning to the notion that everybody talks about the need to adapt and to deal with disruption, but it's not really defined, and it means different things to different people. And we realized that we've been thinking about the same set of issues for a very long time from very, very different perspectives. And sort of my line of work came from risk management and finance, and the lessons learned from corporate side of things and financial side of things. And I will let General Jacoby talk about his side of things, but it was remarkable how aligned it was and complementary it was.
I guess I would say that, again, terrific to be on the podcast with you, and glad to be one of the opening acts of 2020.
Yeah, how cool is that, huh?
Right. I guess that I spent my whole life in the military, and as we went up through different layers of command, increasingly I was doing less military, more interagency, intergovernmental, allied kinds of work, and given a chance to maybe pull back from the knife fight and think a little bit more strategically. So I would say that I came at this more at the strategic side, the leadership side, and the planning side. And throughout my career, we went through 3 major drawdowns in United States military forces: end of the Vietnam War, end of the Desert Storm, and then we drew down. The Budget Control Act of 2011 was essentially a drawdown while in combat, and so that was a particularly difficult one. And we followed the same path every time, which was not to solve the problem of how do we accomplish the same mission or increasing missions with less resources. It was what kind of buzzwords could we come up with to make ourselves feel better about getting cut one more time. And essentially, we had a number of words that we used for every drawdown. We're going to become more efficient. We're going to become more nimble. We're going to become more lethal. And of course, we're going to be more agile. And by the time, and so, okay, when I was a lieutenant and a captain, I'd say, yes, sir, Roger, and move out and think about what that might mean for my section of the pie. And then as I got older, I got a little more cynical about that approach. And finally, as a 4-star general, I said, okay, I want to know what agile means, guys, because it means something different than you think it does, than the Senate thinks it does, does the House think it does. And so I became kind of an activist for being more precise about a strategic approach to our drawdowns. And that created an article for the Joint Force Quarterly that no one read and I thought, if I ever pick up a pen again, I'm going to get somebody credible. I'm going to get a finance guru to help write this next piece on agility, because it didn't resonate with the government. But that's how I came to it. Luckily, I had this link up with Leo, and after 4 years of thinking hard and studying agility together, we came up with a book, and we really hope it helps people.
Cool. Well, having read it, I can tell you, read most of it at this point, I can tell you that it will help people. And I want to get back to that. And I'm actually going to go all into the book, but it's not very often that people get to talk to, if you're me, or listen to in sort of close proximity, if you're watching or listening, with a 4-star general. So I have had a major general, David Bassett, on with me way back early in the podcast. We'll put a link to that for everybody if you want to go back to that. But I just want to I just want to ask you sort of the question that I think a lot of people would want to ask you, Chuck, which I'm having a hard time saying that, but you told me to call you Chuck. So, I mean, your co-author is calling you General Jacoby, but I'm going to call you Chuck. That's what you told me to do. So, sir, and so my question is this. You were in the military, you know, and in that governmental structure for many, many years, clearly. Now you've been out for several years, but I'm just curious from your perspective, what's something about the difference, perhaps, what's something about military leadership, perhaps, that might surprise those of us that don't have that experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought about it a lot as I've kind of dabbled in the business world now a little bit. And I would say our thinking about leadership development is significantly different. It's not a bolt-on. It's organic, and it's a core competency. And whether we're good at it or not, it is a core competency, and we are continually refining it and trying to create agile leaders and the right leaders for the next fight, not the last fight. And I know that a lot of business leaders know that leader development and those kinds of activities within their organization is important, but I see more bolt-on kinds of efforts, and it's an investment, and it's almost like as if it's overhead. So I think for companies, and I think that may be the first one. Then the other thing that's obvious is the incentive structure is different. We almost have no incentive structure in the military except for the Uniform Code of Military Justice and inspirational leadership. While in the corporate world, the incentive structures and the levers for working with large organizations are different.
Yep.
But I will say the most important thing is not the difference; it's the similarity, and that's that. Leo and I both feel, as we've talked about agility, there is some universality to this need to define agility, deconstruct it. Figure out what it is, make sure that it permeates the breadth and depth of an organization, and that it's powerful, and that it's going to, that need for agility and for understanding what it means is going to exist for a long time.
Yeah, and that's a perfect lead in. It's almost like you're looking at my list of possible questions, right? Because my next question is, we've got this book called Agility.
We see everything everywhere, Kevin.
There's a second camera in this room somewhere. That word agility has become almost a buzzword, and you guys have done such a great job with the book. But you, early on in the book, you define it, and so can you tell me, because I think the definition is critical. It's critical to the book, but it's critical for us and even for the rest of our conversation. So how would you define, or how do you define agility?
Leo, over to you.
Yep.
Sure. So we define agility as the organizational capacity to detect, assess, and respond to environmental changes in ways that are purposeful, decisive, and grounded in the will to win. And of course, as you may imagine, every one of these words is a very loaded one. And we spend the first several chapters really explaining what purposeful means in this regard, what decisive means in this regard. What is the will to win that is not necessarily a zero-sum game, but a much broader approach to defining your purpose and your strategy. And then we do a few things. First of all, we distinguish between strategic and tactical agility, and we can dive into that. We define the process of agility, of how any organization can cultivate this repeatable process of detecting, assessing, and responding to change. We talk about the essential competencies and knowledge needed to do that. But last but not least, and that is enormously influenced by Chuck and military thinking in general, is what is the cultural and leadership setting in which agility can take place? So we really, we approach some of the usual topics that people all talk about, the role of accountability and incentives and engagement. But instead of talking about that from the inspirational or moral perspective, we talk about it very specifically about how does this contribute to agility or doesn't.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, and we are talking, if you just joined us for some reason, to Leo Tilman and General Charles Jacoby about their new book, Agility: How to Navigate the Unknown and Seize Opportunity in a World of Disruption. One of the things, there's a couple things I really like about the book I want to dive into. One is all of the real life examples, and both from the military perspective and from the business world perspective. It makes the book a better book and far more interesting to read. But the other thing that you just mentioned is that what it really, I mean, people need to read the book to dive into all of the details of the framework. I'd really like you to talk about the difference between strategic and tactical agility, because I think that to me is one of the key ideas of the book that we can all go do something with tomorrow.
Absolutely. And before I define them, let me just preface it by saying that when you hear organizations and leaders and consultants talking about agility, it almost always, they almost always mean tactical agility. What they mean is, how do you break an organization into a bunch of teams, empower these teams, make these teams nimble, have shorter development cycles, and interact, and so on and so forth. But it's not at all what we mean by agility, and it's most certainly not the broadest organizational sense in which agility exists. So in another part of the book, we talk about the neuroscience analogy of organizations. And from neuroscience, one of the great books that I would love to plug in is called Top Brain, Bottom Brain by a friend and a colleague of mine, Stephen Coslin, who essentially disputed the notion that humans are left brain or right brain. And he talked about instead the psychological and physiological structures of top brain and bottom brain. In the top brain, you think about it as a leadership team, develop strategy, vision, direct execution, etc. And the bottom brain is the rest of the organization. Super important, because they're the ones executing, but they're also the ones on the front lines, reading the environment, seeing what the clients need, etc., etc. So this, first of all, division of labor, and then the interaction between the two is what makes our brain so powerful. So that is the prelude to strategic and tactical agility, because both parts of the organizational brain must be agile and they must collaborate. So strategic agility is a top-down agility. It's the ability of boards of directors and executive teams to detect major changes in the environment, technology, geopolitics, society, etc., and then reposition big picture issues within organizations, vision, strategy, purpose, balance sheet, business model, etc., to that, right? And it has enormous influence on the final result. Now, once that happens, and the rest of the organization goes to implement that, they will encounter their own environmental surprises and changes and obstacles. So they too need to be able to detect them, assess them, respond to them, but on different level, using different levers, right? And one is absolutely not possible within the other. So we talk a lot about when one part of the brain takes over, or one part of the brain outsources its duties to another part of the brain, and examples range from MF Global to Citigroup pre-bailout to the Vietnam War. But the best example that we can think of when both parts of the brain operated at full capacity, went above and beyond what was needed, and ensured success is the invasion of Normandy. And we end the book this way. We couldn't think of a more instructive and comprehensive example, but we also could not think of a more inspirational one.
Yeah, it was a challenge. There are lots of good examples, but then there's the best example. And of course, it was the 75th anniversary. That didn't hurt, having us thinking about it. But I will tell you that it was, a series of great discussions between Leo and myself on how to conclude and really marry the top brain, bottom brain, the strategic and the tactical. Because, I mean, how can you just pick one? We're just going to be tactically agile. That's not going to work. or we're just going to be strategically agile. You know, those of us in the C-suite are going to think of this and make proclamations, and I'm sure everybody out there will, you know, act agilely. And so, and it goes back almost to the leader development question on whether you're doing it organically or outsourcing that. But Normandy, years and years of planning, preparation, bold, purposeful, decisive decision makers as early as 39 and 40, seeing the war coming, risk intelligence, understanding the consequences, the likelihood and the vulnerabilities, the risks associated with not preparing, and then all the way through the training and the repetitions and the building cultures of trust and accountability within the force structure that led to a remarkable performance of tactical agility.
Where everything went wrong, or lots of things went wrong, and it didn't go.
Lots of things went wrong. But you know, our military today still takes from that this idea that we welcome disruption, and that we'll dominate disruption, and we'll win in disruption because of the way we train our leaders and the way we organize our top brain, bottom brain relationship.
Absolutely. I've got a little technology issue going on. So if you're watching me or you're wondering why I'm looking away, having a little bit of a challenge I'm trying to solve as we go here. So I really want to get at this. You said something a second ago. I'm really not sure where I want to head because there's so many things I'd like us to talk about. But you just said something a second ago. You flew through this thing about risk. And it's one of the things I love about the book. It's you guys have a formula for risk. I don't know where it came from, so I'd like to know that, but I'd love for you guys to unpack that for a little bit, because I think, you know, one of the challenges I think for people who might be listening is say, okay, I can get the tactical part, but I need that strategic part. Where's that coming from? And so maybe I'm in an organization right now where I don't have that, and I don't want you to just leave frustrated by that, because I think there's a tremendous amount of stuff that we can take from this conversation. And I'd love for you guys to dive in to that risk formula for us. Can you do that?
Sure. And so this is the origins of this book from my perspective, because Financial Darwinism, my prior book, essentially talked about the fact that we all have standard ways in looking at the world, right? We look at organizational missions and visions and org charts and products and services and so on and so forth. And then we look at income statements and balance sheet statements, and then we're always surprised when the firm goes out of business or something else happens. And to us, it always meant that something fundamental is hidden from view. And that fundamental issue is the portfolio of risks that every organization has. So unmasking that portfolio, understanding it, assessing it, and then proactively managing it over time is what we said in Financial Darwinism was absolutely essential in surviving and succeeding. And of course, the book came out right as Lehman Brothers and AIG were going down, and the premise was sort of validated. Now, so this notion of dynamic understanding and management of your risk as an essential part of agility was where I came from, and then we married it with General Jacoby's perspective. So that was step number one. Step number two is, now that you talk about organizations in the broadest possible sense, from a government agency to a military combat unit, or an army to a organization or a small entrepreneurial company, you need some sort of a language to define what risk means. On a technical level, differentiate risk and uncertainty, which is very, very important sort of philosophical and analytical aspect, and then put it all in action in the context of agility. Now, I don't think I've ever said this to Chuck, but I'm going to send it now. The measure of a brilliant leader or investor or anybody else is that they typically come up with very precise formulas for things that intuitively, that others have derived through loads and loads of mathematical equations. So the basic components of the risk equation is something that Chuck has been thinking about for a very long time, thinking about risk in terms of vulnerability, likelihood, and consequences. And then I said to him, Chuck, you do know that whole books on risk management have been written and presented this formula in a variety of ways. And then we said, oh my God. But what was so interesting, and we spent a whole section in that chapter talking about it, is that in business, we will use the language of what is my exposure? Like how much money did I lend to you, right? What is the probability that you're going to default on it? And how much, if I go after you, how much will I recover of my investment, right? This is the same language of how vulnerable am I? What is the likelihood? And then the consequence. But the moment you change that language, and that is why language matters so much. Yeah. And same with agility versus speed, right? It informs you that actually your vulnerabilities are much broader than you thought, and that the consequences of certain actions are much broader than you thought. And the likelihood is not something that falls off from the sky always, but something that you can affect as well. So we created a whole section called the influence of military thinking, and we essentially went through every one of these and said how much broader and how much more holistic this makes this conversation relative to a typical conversation in business or finance.
What Leo helped me with, in particular with this, that was just a little formula that the way I thought about risk. And of course, a senior leader's job is, and we talk about what are senior leader jobs, and one of them is they own risk and they decide to share risk and where they decide to share risk. And but what Leo helped me with, and I think the book would help others with, is this relationship between vulnerability, consequences, and likelihood, and where you can take purposeful action, and where you can apply resources or you apply intelligence. And we say a fight for risk intelligence, and where do I need to know more? And then how broad is this series of relationships across your whole portfolio of risks? And what are you doing about it? And so it's less about, so the assessment phase gets you started, but then it becomes very much the purposeful, decisive action that you take in order to work against one or all of those components of risk.
So and by the way, every one of your viewers do this on a daily basis. They decide whether to purchase insurance. Would they decide whether to invest in the next cybersecurity protection, right? They decide how to work with a customer so the customer doesn't default on their obligations, and so on and so forth. So everybody is in the business of assessing and modifying their risk equation every single day. The question is, A, have you identified all the relevant dimensions of it? B, do you understand how to assess it and analyze it? And C, do you understand how many tools you have in this process of rebalancing? So the notion that this is an essential function of every leader in every organization, and the dynamism and sophistication with which you do that will probably affect you more so than some of the usual strategic and organizational things you do. So risk is deeply ingrained in both the concept of agility, but also the components of agility, from detection of environmental changes all the way to how you shape strategy and how you execute.
Excellent.
Yeah,
no, please.
If I could jump in, one last thought on that is that as I circle back to the leadership aspect of it, is that this act of, everybody thinks about it as empowering now. They talk about empowering and what does empowering mean. And it goes back to what Leo said, that most of the time when people are talking about agility, they're talking about something very tactical. And that implies that they've empowered something or some group or some people at the edge of the organization. What they're really doing when they make a decision to empower, if it's real, Now there's genuine empowerment, and then there's, false empowerment. And if you don't resource somebody or an organization, if you don't give them authority, if you don't give them guidance and guidelines for, their boundaries for innovating, et cetera, then you're not really empowering. What you're really doing, though, is you're deciding to share risk. You're deciding to share risk. It's an act. It's a trust transaction, is what it is.
100%. Right? 100%. And people that say, I want my people to be empowered. I want my people to be empowered. I'm like, are you setting a boundary, and are you willing to live with the boundary that you're giving them? Right?
And are you willing to live with honest mistakes
Absolutely.
that people will make, and how you react to these mistakes will determine whether they will continue being empowered and make even better decisions and feel accountable, or retreat and say, it's just not worth it, and I don't trust it, and I don't feel supported. So I think these types of elements came from the military culture, and they're essential to agility. Another thing that we really thought from the beginning is that, these worlds of leadership, culture, strategy, management, finance, they're all sort of independent. And people talk about them in silos. Isolated service providers advise companies on these, but agility is all of it. And it must transcend every one of them. So how leadership and culture affect your ability to think about risk, and vice versa. How can you take risks in a way that makes your organization cohesive? It all comes together. So while we touched on all the usual topics that millions of books were written about, culture and leadership and management and so on, approaching it from this very specific perspective of what do they mean and how do they contribute to agility was absolutely paramount.
Yeah, it's really what brings this book together. It's what makes this book different. We are talking with the authors of Agility: How to Navigate the Unknown and Seize Opportunity in a World of Disruption. I shared that subtitle with a group of leaders 2 days ago before I had read very much of this, and they all said, yeah, that's the world I live in. And so if you feel like that subtitle is the world you live in, then you definitely need a copy of this book. So before we wrap this up, I've got a couple more questions for both of you, and I'd like each of you to answer, and they're not about the book. How about that? So it's the two questions that longtime listeners or viewers will know that I ask. And so, Leo, you first on this one. What do you do for fun?
Other than writing books and debating the similarities between business and the military?
Exactly, yes.
I love tennis. To me, tennis has always been this absolutely amazing physical and mental combination. And we actually used a couple of examples earlier in the book on agility in tennis. Yep. And of course, when I looked at some of my favorites of all time, Andre Agassi and Roger Federer and others, it's absolutely amazing how agile they are. Of course, they're naturally talented and they're geniuses in their own right, but how much preparation and thinking goes on both in terms of physical, but also mental, and also the knowledge of the opponent and practice of different things. So that's been my passion outside of writing books, which one should not do at home generally.
Well, and I have the experience that both of you have, is sometimes it's a lot better to write them with somebody than by yourself. So Chuck, what do you do for fun?
Well, it seems that the last 2 years for fun, what I've done is I've had my knees replaced over and over again. So that's not as fun as I thought it would be. And but I'm for fun, my wife and I have always been into fitness, health, and those kinds of things, which makes Colorado Springs the perfect place to be.
There you go.
And when I finish this side gambit of knee work, then I'll be back to that. But I will tell you that this book has been a joy. And one of the things that was a joy about it was partnering with Leo, and we actually took our time on it. It was a long discussion, and we learned things and we changed our mind about things as we went. And so I really more excited about it than I was when we started, and very, very happy to share it. And I think in the future, when I'm up, I don't think I'll ever write another book again, though. I will tell you that.
Leo probably will. Okay, he's already written 4. He's probably not done, and I know that.
You know, generals read PowerPoint decks. We don't.
Yes, you guys are good at those. That I know. So now, one other thing. Now, General Jacoby, I got to end on that one. So you first this time. What's something that you are reading or have read recently that people might find interesting?
I just finished Grant by Chernow. And that may sound dull, I suppose, or just, you know, pedestrian biography. But for West Point, for many, many reasons, we had not, I think, wrapped our arms around U.S. Grant in a way that we should have. In fact, the class of 75 just donated. One donor of the class of 75 built a statue on the plane, finally, at West Point for U.S. Grant. And Chernow is a little bit of a revisionist history of U.S. Grant, but I actually walk away from that book thinking that he was essential partner to Lincoln in the Second American Revolution and in sustaining our value system and our culture and who we are as Americans. And so he's a compelling figure, and compelling to me because he's my size. He's 5'6", and a very ordinary, average guy. But unlike me, he had an extraordinary circumstance that he was able to rise to when the country needed him. And I think that's the American story too. So I was inspired by the book. It's the only way I'd read 1,200 pages.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a heavy lift to rise to and lead through, I'll say. So, Leo, same question for you. What are you reading? You got a whole bookshelf behind you. You got something.
I do. I'm actually rereading something that I very carefully read as we were writing the book, and that's Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. And I find this book, first of all, extraordinary in its breadth and intellect, but similar to what we try to do with agility, Jonathan takes an intractable problem of why we have such profound conflict in our society, and it seems to be only intensifying, and essentially produces a theory that helps explain it. So the theory of moral foundations that essentially talk about specific values and how these values are different, or the emphasis of these values is different across Democrats, Republicans, and libertarians, is incredibly instructive. But for our book, the theory of moral foundations was also important in understanding what are the drivers of cultures and leadership that make people cohesive, that make people unified around a common objective, make people engaged, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these components are absolutely important to agility. So while the theory of moral foundations was typically applied to political science, we applied it to organizational science and agility. And we did exactly the same with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Again, behavioral finance, behavioral economics is typically applied to investing. I have not really seen it being applied to organizational design and organizational science. And to us, it also was very, very important to do that. So, so those two books, I think, have been instrumental in informing some of the elements of agility.
Kevin, do we have time for one more thought on that?
Yeah, I just got to say, you both pick, one of the books you both pick is like this. Like, these guys have not read, next they're going to say War and Peace is what you're going to say in terms of length, right?
Well, you do know that we quote War and Peace in chapter 2, so I had to make sure that that's there.
It's one of the reasons I said that. I'm thinking that might just be an inside joke, but there you go. Yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
Well, just as a nod to, all good generals will give a nod to a dead Prussian if they can. And Leo and I both either read or reread significant portions of On War. And really, it's a theory and practice book. I think the most useful part of it is the theory part. And his approach to theory of building frameworks for testing our reality against. And I think he describes the nature of competitive environments. And I think that's what our CEOs and all of our leaders in business and politics right now, we're going to remain in a constant churn of competitive environments globally. And Clausewitz described the fog and friction of the competitive environments. He described the risk, and he described some of the practices of the commander and that cohesion and teamwork and team building that Leo talked about. And he gave us good insights, even though it's post-Napoleonic and may not seem relevant to the world today. I think it nailed it.
More relevance than we realize if we'll allow ourselves to hear it and see it, right?
We had a very bold aspiration. We said Clausewitz and subsequent science of complex adaptive systems sort of told us the nature of the environment in which we operate, but we didn't have a theory of how you would successfully operate in this environment. So what we tried to do, and I know it may sound arrogant, but to create a sister theory or supplemental theory that says, if that's the nature of the environments in which we live, here's how you would be successful in that.
Perfect. So before we go, Leo, for those who might be watching, I'm going to hold the book up. Tell everyone how they can get a hold of the book, where they can get a hold of you. How can people connect with you guys?
Okay. So if you type agility on Amazon.com, you probably would arrive at the right place. We also have a special website dedicated to the book called theagilitybook.com. And we try to keep it very updated with our commentary, with all the media that we're doing, with additional materials. And we try to engage readers in the conversation, because there's still so much to learn and to discuss about this topic. There are various ways to get in touch with us through that website, and we would love to hear from everybody and hear their thoughts on the book and what we can do better next.
Hey, General Jacoby said there's not going to be a next time. He's done. So before we go, everybody. So again, theagilitybook.com. You can get everything you need, connect with them, find ways to get to the book, all of that from theagilitybook.com, right? All right. So question for all of you who have been listening or watching, and that is, now what? What are you going to do with what you just heard? Maybe you got an idea of a new book that you need to read on top of agility. Maybe you got some really interesting, useful thoughts about starting with the definition of agility, about detecting and assessing and responding, and about purposeful and decisive. And so my challenge to you is, what do you take from this other than, hey, this was an interesting conversation that you can use as a leader in your organization? It's my challenge to you always, is to think about, what are you going to do now, given what you now know? And so I want to thank both of you for being with us. It was a pleasure to have you. As I told you earlier, it's only the second time I've had co-authors with me, both on with me. So it's been a pleasure to have both of you with me.
It's been great fun. Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, Kevin. A lot of fun.
It was my pleasure. So before we go, everybody, we'd love to have you join the conversation, get updates on what's going on, have the chance to engage with some of the things that we're doing, even tell us who you'd like to have on a future episode. You can do all that by joining our Facebook group. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook. You can do that. And as you probably know, or if you don't, you will now, we're here every week. Come back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.